ZoomerLife. Health, wellness, and longevity from the world's brightest minds.
What brought this next speaker to my attention was the title of her book, My Leaky Body. Yeah, it's unusual and actually very brave because it's partially a memoir, partially a manifesto, and entirely moving and genuinely inspirational. It's the story of her struggle with inflammatory bowel disease. What's it called? Ulcerative colitis. And she deals with it, through bits of low humor and other portions of high idealism, and helps us work her way and our way through the maze, which is our public health system. So where's Julie? Here.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So everything I've learned in my life, I would say I've learned from blood and poo. And this particular part of my learning started when I was about 22. I had just moved to Vancouver from Toronto, where I grew up, and had started grad school. And I was in a city far from home, and suddenly having severe bloody diarrhea, and not sure what to do about it. On the one hand, I was 22, so of course believed myself to be immortal. Of course believed that every day would be the day where those random symptoms just went away. And when that wasn't the case, I sort of took myself to the walk-in clinic at the end of my street, presented myself to the doctor, was very uncomfortable about talking about my symptoms. And when I finally described it to him, he looked at me and said, "Well, if there was anything really wrong, you would have lost weight." He didn't ask if I had lost weight. He didn't ask what my energy level was like, didn't do any blood tests. And I felt so ashamed because I was so uncomfortable already in this situation, talking about these very difficult symptoms, and then to have my body scrutinized in this way was really more than I could bear. So I just continued to ignore the symptoms and pretended that I was fine and that everything would be fine. And at the same time, in the middle of the night, I'd wake up when my partner and my roommates were asleep and secretly Google blood and diarrhea and read the websites about colon cancer and terrify myself. Would go back and forth between this, I'm fine, I'm probably going to die, and really just to let myself out of the truth, which is that my body was a leaky mess and I probably didn't have any control about what was going to come next. So I came back to Toronto to speak at a conference, and my mother marched me into our family doctor, and he said, "You should see a specialist," and I wasn't going to be in Toronto long enough to do so. So he said, "If you get a fever, you need to go straight to emergency." So of course, that was what happened, and I developed this extremely high fever. I ended up in the emergency ward, and I had spent a lot of my teenage years in the 1990s protesting the Mike Harris cuts to healthcare, and I remember we had this whole thing about the ambulance tour of Ontario when all the emergency rooms were being cut, and people were dying in ambulances as they were being shuttled around from emerge to emerge that were all so full. So as I was lying in my booth for 6 hours with my partner Blair, we did what we always do in the darkest, worst situations. We sang a silly song. So this booth in the Emerge was a stretcher with a curtain pulled around it, and it was called Room 2. And I can't remember which of us started it, but it went something like, "Come to room 2, talk to Julie about her poo. Come to room 2 to talk to Julie about her poo. We want someone to come to room 2. And when finally someone actually came to room 2 to talk about my poo, it was an emergency room doctor who was so stressed and had been running from one crisis to the next, was simply horrified that I'd been there for 6 hours. My fever was so high, my dehydration level so severe they could barely start an IV. And within the next day or so, I was scoped and first diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. Now, at first, this was a relief. There was medication. I could take it. I could feel better. I could resume my 22-year-old life of going to grad school, of working too many jobs, of being constantly overscheduled. But apparently, that was not to be the case. So a couple months later, I had returned to Vancouver, and I ended up in an emergency ward there, which was literally leaking bodies. There was people in every hallway just spilling out of the doors. The nurses were repeatedly apologizing, as at one point I lay in a gurney in a hallway with my IV poles, that there was just nowhere else for me, until finally they found a little closet. And this closet was in the part of the emergency ward that was being used for people who were being treated for psychiatric situations on an emergency basis. And so there were restraining devices on shelves and needles and tubing all around me. And my closet was this constant bustle of activity as nurses were coming and going to get things off of shelves. And at one point, I'm lying there and just sort of fading in and out of consciousness, not sure what to do with myself, if I'm sleeping, if I'm awake, just in so much pain. And this flood of light descends from the ceiling. And at first I start blinking my eyes, trying to clear my vision of these blue and purple splotches that are now clouding my field of vision, but they don't go away. And in fact, they start to congeal into kind of a blob, and the blob starts to take form. First, I make out little lapels on a suit jacket, neatly coiffed hair, little tie glasses, definitely 1940s style, and I'm puzzling over this as a voice rings out, "What on earth is going on here?" I'm sick? Well, I can see that, but what are you doing in a closet? I don't know. There's nowhere else for me? Good grief! Did the doctors go on strike? Are we back to private medicine? Are you too poor to pay? Are you Tommy Douglas? The father of Canadian medicine? Kiefer Sutherland's grandfather? Yes, climb on. Is that a wing? Where are we going? To the fully funded facility of both of our dreams. And I've thought about this concept many times since then and wondered how we will get to the fully funded facility of mine and Tommy Douglas's dreams, to the healthcare system of our dreams. And I've partly wondered about it because it's a question that interests me personally as someone who's been chronically in the healthcare system for 10 years and dealing with everything that means. But also because I started to take my show, my leaky body, my stories on the road, and I found everywhere I went, that was everybody's question. From coast to coast in Canada, it was a question that was literally haunting me as I considered it and as it frequently came out of people's mouths. And so I think there's two parts to this question. So one part is definitely about resourcing, about prioritizing those moments of care. If we're going to have enough staff, if we're going to have enough space for people, if people will be able to access it in a comfortable way, if providers are adequately resourced. But I think there's another part of that too. And the second part of that, which I believe is equally important, I learned through the experience of going through surgery. So over the course of the year and a half that I described, the medications kept failing. I was in and out of emergency rooms every time they failed, until ultimately a decision was made to remove my entire large intestine, my colon, and temporarily replace it with an ileostomy bag, where a piece of my small intestine was pulled out onto my abdomen and put into a bag where it would empty. And as a young woman with all the typical body image issues I had, this was a terrifying and horrifying prospect to me. But what filled me with even more horror, more shame, and more sadness was some of the reactions I would get from health providers. And at the same time, What filled me with more hope, more optimism, and provided me with more healing than anything else was the health providers who could meet me with complete comfort and support me in believing that everything was going to be okay. So, for example, when I first got my stoma, I remember before I was even brave enough to look at it, there was a class of medical students, and they were around my bed. I mean, class is a strong word. There was maybe 7 or 8 of them. And they were asking to see my stoma, and so I lifted up my gown, and they all looked away. They couldn't quite disguise the sort of shudder, flinch, wouldn't quite look at my face. And in that moment, when I was already feeling so scared, that just reinforced every feeling of shame that I had in that moment. And also, conversely, I had nurses who were so comfortable with my blood, with my poo, with whatever was going on, that they made me feel comfortable too. They had absolutely no concern about anything being gross or being uncomfortable. All they cared about was my feelings of safety, my feelings of acceptance. And so I started wondering, how can I take this message to providers where they're being taught, where they're practicing? How can my leaky body be a vessel for this education? So I started doing performance pieces. I was studying in grad school, and I was studying clinical encounters and looking at the one-on-one, using my own stories to illustrate examples, performing some of the worst moments of my experience, as well as the exciting hallucinations of Tommy Douglas. And I started thinking about how we could get these providers telling their own stories too. So I developed a strategy based on the fact that I think humor is the best vehicle to get us through anything that all of us are uncomfortable with and that all of us have trouble dealing with or are ashamed of. And also because it's so perfect that I have colitis because bums are funny. Pretty much universally, everybody feels that way. So it was this ideal opportunity for education, for training, for discussion. So I would do my performance. We would do a storytelling exercise where staff would talk about things that had happened for them. We would make sure that all of these stories were told in a way that had no judgment attached to them. We simply wanted to look at what went wrong, consult with one another about what could go better next time. So then I would invite 2 volunteers up to the front of the room for what I described as mock rectal exams. And I would offer them the option, as the 2 came up, gown or glove, and they would choose. And we would replay one of the worst rectal exams I ever had, and then have the opportunity to replay it in a way where they could give their own feedback and advice. And the thing I found the most powerful every time this happened, as it was enacted by 2 strangers who were also health providers, was that the person in this encounter who felt the most comfortable when they replayed the story, where they got full consent, where they had a full conversation with the person whose bum they were about to touch and negotiated, they were so much more comfortable, not just the person in the gown, but the person with the glove. The person performing the procedure had a much better experience when that was the case. And so that, to me, is the real message, that when we can remove the shame, when we can take away the idea that somebody is wrong and somebody is right, when we can liberate even providers and professionals from the burden of expertise where they feel so ashamed when they don't know the answer, where they feel so uncomfortable when they're encountering mess. And that allows people in my situation to actually feel safer, more comfortable, like we have a voice, like we're being heard. And also, that, for me, was the most healing thing. There was certainly some great medical innovations through surgery, through medication, that saved my life at points, and I can't stress that enough. At the same time, what I think was the most healing was the moment that through relationships with healthcare providers who were so safe, who were so capable of listening, who were so present in the moment and able to have that negotiation, I actually felt safe, comfortable, and okay with my body. And I have what I describe now as a leaky diagnosis, because there's one set of professionals who now thinks I have Crohn's disease, and another set who say it's still ulcerative colitis. And I've actually stopped caring. I've decided that after 10 years, you can call it anything. I'm okay with that, and I'm okay with whatever is going to come to my body the next day, the next day, the next day. And so, as this question comes up again, because it always does, when I talk about all of these issues around healthcare, if I don't talk about the politics first, as I did today, it always comes up anyway. Somebody says, how is this even possible? We don't have the resources. There isn't the motivation to fund healthcare anymore. All of these sorts of questions. So how do we get to the healthcare system of mine and Tommy Douglas's dreams, which includes the support for staff so that they can be the most humane and compassionate they can possibly be, because they have the resources behind them, they have colleagues who they can speak to without shame, they feel safe in dropping that burden of expertise and having an honest one-on-one conversation with a patient. And I think about how we almost speak about it as if it's this mystical outside force that determines whether or not we can afford this, and that there's something so finite and exact and permanent about all of the systems we've put in place that make these decisions, when in fact, we make those systems. Human beings chose to organize things this way. So my answer as a patient activist, as a leaky body, as a proud leaky body, when people say, is it possible to create the healthcare system? I say, is it possible to progress as a society without it? Can we actually afford to move any further in this world without acknowledging, without shame, but actually with complete honor, that we're all living in these messy, leaky bodies that are prone to break down at any moment, and our measure as a society surely is how humanely and fully we address that question on a day-to-day basis. And so I think that's in all of our hands. I am optimistic in the future because I think this is our priority. This is the reality of who we are as a society. And I just want to thank all of you so much for having me here today. It's such an honor to be among all of you, to be among the speakers and the musicians who've already graced this stage. So my leaky body, thanks you all. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I'll take a picture.